From our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus.
Good Sunday afternoon. Welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Kate Walsh. We are living in an age of terrorism. Almost every day we hear of atrocities in the Middle East, and shared in that horror of the attacks in Paris and recently in Belgium. Those attacks of terror don't seem so far away when we remember the Boston Marathon bombing just about 3 years ago, and recently the San Bernardino attacks in California. So today on 22 News in Focus, we'll talk about these and other attacks by extremist organizations, who these people are and what's being done to track their leaders. We'll find out what's being done right here in the U.S. and especially here in Massachusetts to protect us from these incidents. Before we hear from security experts, we'll begin with some background on the terrorist organizations claiming responsibility for many of these attacks. So joining me now is former U.S. Ambassador to Lebanon and Qatar, Mark Hambley. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Kate. It's a pleasure.
So you have a wealth of knowledge of the Middle East, and in fact, you were just telling us how you were recently in Belgium just before the attacks. Can you talk about ISIS in general right now in the Middle East and why they're branching out, it seems, to Europe and possibly the United States?
Sure, I'll try to. It's a very complicated topic. There are really two terrorist organizations we're concerned about. One is, of course, Al-Qaeda. Second is ISIS. Both at one time were together, but they split in February of 2014 when ISIS started to expand into Syria and into Iraq. ISIS is a group which comes from two different elements. One is a very rigorous puritanical version of Islam, which has adherents in certain countries, Saudi Arabia and in Iraq and Syria. And also it's a group of people who actually came from the former Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein. And they're the ones who provide a lot of the military tactics which have given it the impulse it's had to overtake so much of the territory in Iraq and Syria. So ISIS stands for the Islamic State in Iraq and Sham, which is Syria. And that actually is sort of a misnomer because now it's much broader than that,
right,
say the least. But what it has basically two goals. The goals are contradictory. Part of its main focus is to draw the United States very blatantly into a land war in the Middle East. Why? It bases its whole being on the fact that they are a prophetic group which says Armageddon is coming. It's Islam versus the non-believers. Come join us. And this is the appeal they make throughout the world, all Muslims, to come and join the new caliphate which has been declared in Raqqa in Syria.
Now, before we continue, they're attacking Middle Eastern countries as well, where there are many Muslims. So why would they be attacking their own people, so to speak?
Because they have a view that only they have the true word.
Okay.
Anyone who does not believe that the caliphate, first of all, exists is considered a kafir, a non-believer. That includes those from Al-Qaeda. In Syria, there's a group called Nusra Front, who are Al-Qaeda. They are as bad as ISIS in terms of their view of the world, but they don't believe the time is yet for a caliphate. And that's why there's a huge concern between those two groups, why they fight one another. Again, Shiite Muslims, Shiites, the majority of the population in Iraq, are considered kafir because they are considered not true believers. So they massacre them at an opportunity. Indeed, basically we're seeing a Muslim-on-Muslim war going on now. It's been going on for centuries, but it goes on and, in and out of focus, but now we're seeing a very intensely Muslim against Muslim attack. But why are they expanding now? One reason is because they want to create circumstances that will force the United States to bring land troops into war against them. Why do they want the United States to do that? They view the United States as being the Crusaders. The whole vision of that there's going to be an Armageddon. You have to have a battle where you bring the foreigner, the kafir, against the true believer. And this is what they want to bring us into a battle in order to have that. Now, why are they going to do that? They want to have some sort of terror attack in the United States, in Europe, to force us into an attack against them.
And they're also attracting a lot of people from the United States to join their side. We keep hearing about these people flying over to Syria, somehow sneaking in and joining ISIS. Why is it attractive to people in the United States who, we're so westernized that we don't really have much in relation to these ISIS troops?
Well, there's really no good statistics, but it's estimated there are perhaps as many as 30,000 foreigners engaged in the fighting with ISIS. Al-Qaeda is much more Syrian local Arab nationals. But most of those foreigners actually come from Western Europe, not from the United States. The United States, we estimate, again, only estimates, 200 maybe have gone over, but from France, over 2,000, from Belgium, another 1,000, maybe more, from the UK, maybe 1,500. No real numbers, but these are where the radicalized Muslims are coming from. Also from Chechnya, from Russia. Those people are coming in. And also you have swarms of people coming in from Tunisia, from Libya, from other Arab countries that are coming in. And they're all being organized by this former Saddam military element, which gets good tactics and has the benefit of using all those weapons which they captured from the Iraqi army in 2014 at their disposal. In the United States, why are they attracted? This is a very unique phenomenon. They've used the internet, and they've used to an effect which is astounding. They have a brief message, this message about Armageddon coming, and this is published in magazines called Dabiq. Dabiq is a small town in Syria where the Armageddon fight, one of the two places where Armageddon is supposed to be fought. And they say it'll start once the United States attacks Dabiq. Dabiq is also the place where they murdered the former U.S. Army Ranger, the first beheading of the American back in 2014, to make the point that this is to attract the United States and to attack us there. But this magazine, if you see it, it's published as good as Time or Newsweek. They have a lot of money to do this sort of thing. It's very well funded. They have at their apogee, they had about, come to the size, the whole United Kingdom under their control, 8 million people, about $8 billion worth of revenue. That is now being severely restricted, in both territories being recaptured and the source of finance are being reduced, but that still makes a lot of money available to sort of propagate to the West.
So is it only a matter of time before we see more attacks in London, other huge European cities where maybe a lot of people have been recruited and they've done their training in Syria with ISIS and now they're headed back home to attack where they're from? Well,
this, of course, the great concern everyone has. There was a pronouncement made by ISIS after the Belgium bombings that 3 cities are our targets now: London, Berlin, and Rome. They, in fact, probably go to Madrid or some other city that isn't quite, the authorities aren't quite as well prepared to handle them. But the difficulty is that both the French and the Belgian instances were intelligence failures. We know some of the people who were engaged in those activities were on lists. We had no idea about their plotting. They're going through these very highly encrypted cell phone techniques, so we don't have the same mechanism available to us as we had at 9/11 and thereafter in our own country, and that is indeed a great hindrance to our security authorities in order to try and get the heads up about forthcoming attacks.
And this was also huge in Belgium because it's the capital of the European Union and NATO.
Absolutely.
So for that to happen right under their fingertips with all of these major controls right there, this must have been huge, right? Brussels is...
Yeah, I think the problem there is the lack of coordination amongst intelligence agencies in Europe itself. It's a European problem. Certainly, you know, there's different levels of intelligence sharing amongst governments, the closest one being the United States, Canada, U.S., Australia, New Zealand, the 5 English-speaking countries. We have a very close relationship. We share everything. And then it sort of goes, our NATO allies get a certain amount, but we don't want leakage. And sometimes we have problems with leakage. Some countries don't take secrecy quite as seriously as we do. And this has been a problem within Europe, too. They have a whole new organization they had for all 28 members to share intelligence, but it's only as good as its weakest member. And there are many weak members in Europe.
So do you see now moving forward after this terrible attack more communication, or are we all the countries still kind of
No, absolutely. There has to be more communication, but I'm afraid we will see additional attacks. I think that's almost an inevitability, I hate to say. In the United States as well, San Bernardino was attributed to ISIS people. The lady, you know, committed herself a bay'ah to the allegiance to Abu Bakr, the so-called caliph. But the Chattanooga attack, which killed our Sergeant Sullivan, was actually by a young man who had allegiance to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda remains the main threat, frankly, to the U.S. longer term. ISIS is really, it's a damaged goods now. They're being increasingly under assault by having their wealth is being destroyed, their oil. They have a lot of oil wealth, which is being cut by destroying the distribution network, their ability, the sites are being blown up, taking a lot of innocent civilians in the process, but fortunately, that's a problem of aerial combat, I'm afraid. And increasingly, there'll be an effort to try to take over Raqqa. The difficulty is we need to have Sunni Muslims have to remove ISIS. And that's difficult to find Sunnis who are willing to do that. The Sunnis who are fighting the regime in Damascus are against Bashar al-Assad, who himself is not a Sunni. He's an Alawite, which is a different group entirely. The Kurds are within 30 miles of Raqqa, but they don't want to move in on a Sunni area. They want to stay in their own Kurdish areas where they've been very successful. So there's a big problem trying to find who's going to take out Raqqa and who's going to eliminate them on the ground there.
And that will be key.
That's very key. But they've already spread to 10 different so-called provinces throughout the world. In Libya, we've seen them, these massacres, these poor Christian, Coptic Christians, beheadings there. We've used some drone strikes to wipe out some of the people that have carried out those attacks in Tunisia against innocent civilians in Sousse, and other attacks at the main museum in Tunis. These are all done by ISIS. But you still have further afield down in Mali and in Algeria, and you have Al-Qaeda of the Maghreb, of the Western Arabia, Western Africa is very much in play. And of course, then you have Boko Haram, which has pledged allegiance to Abu Bakr in Raqqa. But
so many organizations all related
so many
to
organizations,
terrorism.
yeah.
We are going to be talking extensively today about security and how all of this will improve in the future, hopefully. But we're so happy that you were able to join us today and talk about the background of these terrorism organizations. So now we have some context moving forward. So thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate it. We're always glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about terrorism and what's being done to keep you safe. We just spoke with a former U.S. ambassador to the Middle East about who these terrorists are and their motivations and what the international community is doing to seek out and break up these dangerous organizations. Joining me now for a panel discussion on what's being done to protect us right here at home are West Springfield Fire Chief Bill Flaherty, Chicopee Police Officer Mike Wilk, Michael Scharf, the Director of Planning and Development for Peter Pan Bus Lines, Peter Ostrowski, State Fire Marshal, Patrick Carnevale, Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, or MEMA, Region 3 and 4 Manager. So we truly appreciate you all being here today for this panel discussion. You know, the recent terror attacks in Europe have people thinking about safety, using public transportation and going to large events or big public spaces. The bombings at the Boston Marathon had first responders and national security organizations working together to come up with plans for prevention and response. The marathon bomber was an eye-opener for many here, especially in Massachusetts, because it affected us all. So I'd like to hear from each of you and how your organization might have changed a bit from 3 years ago when the Boston Marathon bombing happened, and if not then after September 11th, because we have seen huge changes in security at least since then. So whoever would like to lead it off can go ahead with that.
Well, 9/11 did change quite a bit for law enforcement, and the Boston Marathon being so close to home added to that. There's now much more communication between agencies. There's much more information sharing. We have officers that work with the FBI, with Homeland Security to stay on top of these type of things.
But from a fire
I couldn't agree more. I think in light of the marathon bombing, we've really increased the level of scrutiny that these large venue events go through. And I think we've brought a lot of capabilities across the spectrum, across agency, across disciplines to the table to really raise the level of evaluation, a lot of intelligence that's shared, and I think we have a good command and control presence during the race especially. And I think following 9/11, certainly a lot was made of interoperability, a lot was made of information sharing, and I think a great deal of good work has taken place since then in all areas. I know in the Department of Fire Services we have a number of teams that assist municipalities in responding to these kinds of incidents, and a lot of technology and a lot of procedural work has been done with municipal, state, and federal agencies to really work together.
Yeah, just to add on to what Peter said, I agree that, you know, after 9/11 we saw changes definitely in public safety, but I think even since the marathon, things have even become more improved, if you could put it that way, meaning that federal, state, and local, just as Peter said, it's not their individual silos. Everybody works together. It's a unified command. It's not one person in charge. No agencies are left to the side any longer. They're all encompassed into the planning, and the planning process starts earlier, longer. You know, you start planning for the marathon the day after the marathon's done, and they continuously go on. Without that, and without the cooperation of all, there's no entity any longer that thinks they can do it themselves, whether it's a city, town, or an agency. It really encompasses everybody, and you need that in order for the event to be successful and safe.
And from a fire department that runs an ambulance, working with the mass casualty incidents, you know, a lot more drilling with that, a lot more new equipment coming out as far as the quick clot and the tourniquets for those you know, severe injuries. And then you also have the Department of Fire Services, state hazmat teams working with the bomb squads and the local fire departments in order to make sure they're capable of responding and handling those situations.
I think lessons learned too, Kate, across the spectrum. Recently there was a symposium in Boston following the Paris incident where especially EMS shared a lot of good information. And I know the same thing happened after the marathon bombing, that Boston and the region shared a lot of information, not only in Massachusetts, but internationally, about response and procedures and lessons learned from those kinds of incidents. We all learn from those.
And Kate, I believe you were at the last symposium we just did at Deerfield Academy, where the FBI, and just along with the fire marshal saying, where the FBI and the Western Mass Homeland Security Council put on a symposium in regards to the active shooter. And they had state police from Newtown and officer from Newtown that went over everything that happened. And there was over 600 people in attendance, a wide variety. Again, the key is the wide variety. It wasn't just it wasn't just police, fire, it was EMS, it was all disciplines involved. And they brought so that we could learn from the good things they did and some mistakes they made. I mean, it's gonna happen. And those are the biggest, I think, as Peter's saying, those are the biggest ones. I mean, okay, so this time it wasn't 100%, but each time we get it better, and that goes along with everything. So,
how about transportation-wise? How has bus security changed since these recent attacks?
As you probably know, Peter Pan was started in Springfield over 80 years ago, and starting then and even to today, the safety aspect was always our top corporate goal, and I think since 9/11, and security has been added to that goal, and a lot of improvements have been made over the ensuing years, and particularly the technology has changed so much with the ability to monitor what's happening on the bus, where it is, knowing when the bus might be off route for some reason, and communications between our dispatchers and our drivers, and there's been a lot of improvements, and then also in the terminals, in the facilities, the garages and the terminals there's cameras everywhere, there's lights everywhere, there's gates and locks everywhere now, so there's been some great improvements over the last 15 years.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a lot about transportation hubs in general, so we'll get back to that and go deeper into that. First, I do want to talk about, you each mentioned how security has boosted in your agencies. What about training? What does that entail to have this higher security? How do you train these people? Are there certain forces within your agency focused on terrorism or disasters, or does everyone go through some kind of training now that maybe they didn't in recent years?
Well, in our department, there is specialized training. We do have a specialized unit, a special response team. We also have an underwater recovery team, response team. They do train for events such as the Boston Marathon or any other larger events. They are available to assist other agencies as well. All of our officers in our in-service training do get updates on this type of incident, on this type of a mass casualty event, and we stay up to date with current events as well. We do have briefings. I do get emails from the FBI, from Homeland Security that are passed on to everyone. Obviously, we can't discuss everything we do. We can't discuss all the aspects of our
We
training.
don't want you to.
Right, and who we train with, but our department's prepared. We hope it never comes to where we have to test our preparedness, but our guys feel comfortable and they do go through extra training. No one wants to be part of this event, but in the same token, if something does happen, we want to be able to help and calm the situation as quickly as we can.
I think the fact of the matter is all these incidents start as local incidents, and really the local incident commander really calls for the appropriate assistance. I know within the Department of Fire Services we house the Massachusetts Firefighting Academy, so a lot of training is accomplished for all firefighters across the Commonwealth in a variety of topics. Recognition, for instance. What may start out as an odor investigation that one engine company from West Springfield responds to can turn into something quite different when they investigate. A medical emergency that the ambulance responds to can, through recognition, a lot can happen. And specialized teams, again, are part of all of the disciplines, I believe, but within the fire service, in enhancing the local response, we have the regional hazardous materials teams, 2 of which are housed here in Western Massachusetts, 2 of the 6. We also have technical rescue teams who work on complicated and long duration incidents, and we dovetail that with federal resources as well as other state resources. So the National Guard Civil Support Team, we work regularly with them. We work regularly with the state police by virtue of the bomb squad being housed within DFS. And then we also work with a host of federal agencies to supplement the resources that are necessary in those large incidents.
And I want to get to MEMA and local agencies as well, but we're going to have to take a quick break and we'll be right back. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Right now we have a panel discussion on safety and security following recent terrorism attacks around the world and even some, unfortunately, here in the United States. So we were talking about training before the commercial. We didn't get to some of the agencies, so I think you were about to speak about.
Sure, the only thing I'll add to it is when we have larger events, Boston Marathon, Big E, we'll bring in federal courses funded by DHS, completely funded, so there's no cost statewide. Brought in, and those specialized courses will be offered to surrounding areas, surrounding communities that are involved in the big events. We'll be doing the same thing, as I said, when the Big E comes up sometime, hopefully about a month or so before the Big E. And we'll bring those specialized courses in for police, fire, EMS, and to support them as well. So
I think we should also recognize the regional Homeland Security Councils.
Absolutely.
And funding that does come in to the Commonwealth that is again, it's distributed across to the councils, and the Western Mass Council is very active. But all the councils have sponsored a number of trainings in specific areas, and they're really driven by those incidents that we can envision happening, and bringing those teams, those important teams that we mentioned earlier, together. And a lot of good investments have been made through the Department of Homeland Security funds that have been employed by those Homeland Security Councils. And
I do want to mention that Homeland Security was going to have someone here, but they're so busy with training and preparing for the Boston Marathon, which is just over a week away now, that they weren't able to come here. But obviously we understand that. They are doing exactly what we're talking about today. Do you have training for bus services and transportation as well?
We do. It's part of when a new employee comes, a new driver comes, it's part of their 6-week-long training program, and every employee, not just drivers, but terminal staff, even managers, attend a special training course that's taught by a retired colonel who helps us. It's called Cat Eyes, and it's really keep your eyes on everything. And we drill into all of our people and our customers as well. The saying, if you see something, say something. It's not just a slogan, it's really effective. This morning there was a bus station in Virginia that was evacuated for 45 minutes or so with a suspicious package, and it turned out to be nothing. But that was brought to the attention of the terminal staff by a passenger. So, you know, they're, you know, as many eyes as we have, there are 100 more eyes watching.
Yeah, and it seems like the public really is key in nowadays in really looking out for things. We've been seeing on the Mass Pike and other transportation, you know, big roads and stuff. We've seen these signs recently saying, if you see something, say something. It is a very important slogan, as you said.
That's you know what, that says it all right there, and we can't stress that enough. If you see something, say something. Don't hesitate. Don't feel funny. You know, the whole concept of being a snitch is gone in this day and age. There's no such thing. If you see something, report it. Let the police, let the fire, let us be the ones to go out and judge if there's something wrong. You know, there's different things to look for. If you know, you want to touch on that, you know, vehicles that are suspicious. If you see someone that's possibly going door to door or taking measurements of bridges or buildings or things like that, absolutely call. Don't think it's a waste of time. Don't second guess yourself. Call, let us go out and look into it.
Is there any way that we're going a little too extreme with some things? I remember particularly, I don't know, maybe it was a year after the Boston Marathon bombing, someone walked down the street and there was a backpack on its own. That might have been right after the marathon, I'm not quite sure. But then there was a big bomb squad that came in and looked at the backpack, and come to find out it wasn't anything. Are there cases where we're going too extreme with security, or is that not a thing?
No.
No,
Absolutely
not
not.
at all. No.
No.
Nobody's more familiar with your surroundings than you. Nobody's going to be able to identify something that's out of place and doesn't fit than the folks that are in that area all the time. And we know in this day and age that nothing's off limits as far as the approach that might be taken by somebody who wants to perform one of these terrible acts. So I think it's vitally important that people, if they see something, they say something. It's the only way we can react. And again, there's a variety of tools that are in use by all disciplines of public safety that can be employed to determine, you know, the viability of a particular object or the need for appropriate response. But I would never classify those as overkill.
No.
No, not at all.
No, I would say too, you know, there's been a big focus about there's 5,000 law enforcement officers involved in the Boston Marathon. Well, that's 5,000 people, 5,000 officers, but there's 1 million people there at the race. So the more eyes and ears that we have supporting those 5,000 police officers or firefighters or whoever it is, that's what's going to keep everything safe. People always ask me, you know, what do we got to do to keep this marathon safe? Well, you have 1 million people there. So if everybody's working on the same task to keep it safe, no, I would never say that, you know, tell us if there's a backpack that you're uncomfortable about. Tell us if there's a vehicle that's parked somewhere that doesn't belong there. We've had that in the past where it's been called in and said, hey, all of a sudden there's a vehicle parked in a streetway that shouldn't be there. And they'll go and investigate. As Officer Wilkes said, let them go decide if it's safe. You wouldn't want to look back and say, oh, I should have, I saw that. And
Right.
No.
Absolutely. And even to touch on it a little more with the Boston Marathon, you know, if you're there to see runners and you're there to see a race, cheer people on, if you see someone that's not focused on that but focused on buildings and possibly doing drawings or focused on a vehicle or something that's they're not focused on what the event is, that's something you may want to tell somebody. And again, you can't be too cautious. We'd rather err on the side of caution. We'd rather be safer than not safe. We'll absolutely check it out. It's what we do.
yeah.
How about from a local fire perspective? You guys have to focus not just on fires, of course, fighting fires, but bombs, incendiary devices, you know, these things that maybe before you might not have had to focus as much on, but in this day and age with these crazy bombs people are coming up with, your job probably has changed a bit, right?
Yes, it has. And it has because of the scenarios that are out there or the things that have happened. You know, you look at France, you take Paris, and what happened over there, it was just a restaurant, outside a restaurant it happened.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so if somebody calls, somebody saw something, we go out there, we work hand in hand with our police department, and now you're getting more and more, like Pat said, you know, the FBI, Homeland Security, everybody's on board. Nobody's saying, hey, you jumped the gun or you shouldn't have done this here. And that's the big thing, is to go out there, get the necessary resources that you need, and then, you know, it's handled prior to hopefully anything happens.
And I did like what you mentioned earlier about how everything starts as a local incident. So can we kind of talk about a situation where We'll go from the beginning to the end, such as Boston. We'll come up with one, and actually we have to take a break right now, but when we come back we'll talk about an incident that might have happened, and then the local reaction, and then further on how that would be brought out, and even how transportation might be a good tool to get people out of a dangerous situation, as well as just the daily transportation that you're used to dealing with. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back, and we'll talk just about that. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking all about security following recent terrorist attacks around the world, and some unfortunately here in the United States. So just before the break we were about to start a scenario where we would all get involved and talk about how each organization really does work together in a disaster situation. So let's just, for the sake of this, say that there was a marathon bombing type situation in West Springfield. How would the police and fire stations there, we'll pretend that you're the police department in West Springfield, how would you first react? Because it would start as a local incident.
Yeah, our engine company or deputy chief engine company, they would respond to the scene. They would clear the scene, get everybody away from it, and then look from a distance, depending on what we were looking at. Say if it was a backpack or a backpack that was left on the near the mosque. We have the mosque in West Springfield. Say if it was near there, okay, we want to make sure everybody's clear of it, and then we would notify, then the police would be responding also, and then, through intelligence, that the police might have, and through the FBI, Homeland Security, and other different agencies, there might be something that was said, possibly that could happen at that location or to mosques around the country, and, and then we would call in the different resources, bomb squads, state police bomb squads, and like I said, the FBI and everyone else. So. And
figure out what exactly was in that backpack if it didn't already explode.
Right. At least to investigate it.
Right, and part of the process too, you would secure the area. You would get people out. You would create a safe zone. Part of it from the police point of view as well is that you do have to secure the scene because it potentially could become a crime scene, and evidence that could be left would have to be preserved if it did turn out to be something. Safety is paramount. Officer safety, fire department safety, anybody around the area is your utmost goal at first. Get those people out of there, make it safe so that no one gets hurt, and then just secure the scene. Calls would be made to specialized agencies, Homeland Security, FBI. Intelligence gathering would begin. You'd be calling to see if there were any threats or anything like that. Some departments, we would be checking social media to see if there was anything that was there that could have been left, any type of threatening message or things like that, and then you just work the scene from there.
Let's say that it did explode. Let's move it away from a politically sensitive topic of the mosque and just put it, let's say, by the Rotary or something. So it's just a random place. We're not sure who's responsible, who it's attacking, but it's exploded. There are a lot of people around. How do larger agencies, other than just local police and fire, then get involved?
Sure. So again, the local incident commander calls for the resources that he or she indicates is necessary to respond to that, and the state agencies, the federal agencies, really respond to that request. There's, as Pat mentioned earlier, there's a unified command that's established so that the variety of response organizations and the disciplines they represent work together to bring together all those issues and to work through those. I think there's a somewhat of a priority that you go through as that incident unfolds, beginning with public safety, getting the public that can get away from there cleared, transportation of the injured, and then scene security and the beginning of collection of evidence and information. But those agencies like the State Police Bomb Squad, the Regional Hazardous Materials Team, Technical Rescue, if it's indicated, command and coordination resources like command posts and support agencies come to bear. Depending on the area that's involved, we may be looking at evacuating and housing area residents for extended periods of time. Could be a large damage incident, or it could be a continued threat that would indicate that we need to establish shelters, and that's where a lot of agencies come into play as well. So it's really full spectrum from that initial call. You know, the 911 center it's a local call, but from there it really grows, expands, and contracts as necessary, and invoking private industry in a variety of ways as well. You know, those moving large masses of people, we would depend on Peter Pan and other transportation agencies to work collaboratively through those incidents. And those are the things that take place routinely during those incidents.
Yeah, just to touch base, we'd obviously reach out to Chief Flaherty in this case. We'd coordinate and support him in any way that we could through any type of state resources he may need. As Marshal Ostrowski said, we would help him support with shelters, with evacuation, with reunification centers, that type of support. So we would be there to support the chief. Again, I think the key is, as the Marshal said, is that this incident is local. All these state and federal resources, agencies, whatever there, are there to support him. And it would be a unified command, thus meaning that he would expand and contract that as he needed, but he would include in his unified command the people that are essential to those decision making at the time, whether it's the beginning, middle, or end of an incident. And that's how it would really work together. And that's where we see the best, I think, to be very honest with you. That's where I've seen the improvements, I guess I should say, over the years, is it's no longer the fire chief or the police chief or EMS person standing alone. It's a group. If you take the incidents here in Springfield, you know, we'll use the tornado as an example. There's the mayor, but with the mayor is the fire chief, the emergency management director, police chief, EMS, and they're all there to support that unified command. And I use the tornado as an example because people always think, you know, the city of Springfield, obviously a large city, they ran things very well because of the fact it was a unified command. At no time was it one person trying to say, I'm in charge. That type of mentality is gone.
Right.
So
Have
I
you
think that's
found
great.
it's been gone since September 11th or more recent than that?
I would say changes started since September 11th. Gentlemen, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah,
I mean,
yes. Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree with that.
I think it improves constantly.
Yeah.
I honestly do. I see a lot of positive things happening amongst
Absolutely.
public safety entities, heightened cooperation, from information sharing all the way to you know, boots on the ground.
Yeah.
I think we've seen a lot of good work. And I would also want to focus in too, you know, when we talk about that scenario, and when you talk about things like the marathon or the 4th of July on the Esplanade, the Big E or other events, a lot of good early planning is taking place now too. So you see that collaboration isn't just happening during an emergency. It's the lead up. It's the analysis of the significance of incidents or of events that are happening, and some review of, you know, the posture that's being taken by public safety to make sure that they continue to be safe events.
Right, and I think I can speak for everybody. We don't have that, oh, it'll never happen here, being said anymore.
Not anymore.
That mentality is gone,
It's
because
gone.
that was a big mentality, it being a small city, a small town.
Yep.
You know, this isn't going to happen here. That's gone. No one thinks like that anymore. Nobody talks about that anymore. Everybody prepares, and it's a team. Everybody works it as a team. You know, everybody has contact information.
Yep.
We're able to get in touch with each other and work as a team because we do have a goal, and everybody's working to that same goal.
Well, I can see that here. You all know each other, and you knew each other before we started this program today. So I can tell that you have been communicating because you're not
critical.
from the same agency, yet you still all are familiar with each other before. We're going to talk about transportation hubs when we come back. You're watching 22 News in Focus. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about security and safety in Massachusetts when it comes to terrorism, especially around big public events and at transportation hubs. So that's what we're going to talk about now. Transportation hubs. Mike, you work with Peter Pan Buses, a huge company with buses everywhere. You have trips from here to New York to Boston, all across the Northeast. So you were saying that the buses are also going to play an important role in this year's Boston Marathon.
Sure. we're participating along with many other bus companies. And the runners assemble at Boston Common, and they're taken out to the starting line. And there's a very high security presence there on the buses. The police, local and state police, FBI, Secret Service, they're all got a hand in it. And the buses are extremely secure, and what the runners can bring with them and the kind of containers they're in. So
I'm sure that requires a lot of planning ahead of time, not just the day of the marathon.
oh no, yeah, they start planning for the next year when it ends on after Patriots Day. It starts for the next year.
For the next year, exactly. So we'll talk about transportation hubs in general. You were talking a little bit before about the security at bus stations nowadays. I can imagine, especially buses going into New York City, that must be much different now than it was 10, 20 years ago when it comes to safety. Can you elaborate on that?
It is. The bus system in general is kind of an open system. And besides New York City Port Authority Terminal or Boston South Station, we stop on a curb in front of a general store in Lee or Lenox or Amherst Center. So it's much harder to control a terminal like an airport. But we try to be as diligent as we can in we get identification and names and so forth when people are buying tickets. We train our employees to not to, I guess it's called behavioral profiling, where there's certain behaviors and actions that, would raise some concern and perhaps further scrutiny. But and we have, as I said, cameras everywhere that are monitored and try to see if there's some unexpected activity that should be investigated.
Right. So it seems like, going onto a bus, even a train nowadays, Amtrak, it seems like it's still that freedom of, great, I can walk right on. I don't have to wait hours in line at an airport to go through security, take out my laptop out of my bag. But you're saying behind the scenes, there's a lot of security going on, and people are watching us. And even if it's just our names documented in case something were to happen.
Yeah, there's a lot of watching, and if, something was to change with that and try to be more like an airport, it would be a dramatic shift in our system, not Peter Pan system, but our whole transportation system. We at the Springfield Bus Terminal interconnect with PVTA, for instance, and other bus companies, and it would just be a dramatic change in how we do business.
After the Brussels attack at the airport, almost instantly we heard from state police saying, this is what's happening here. We've boosted security. I was at Logan Airport. I noticed, security and police dogs walking all around each terminal. You could tell right away that this was a heightened security situation. Did you also notice that in your agencies after this kind of attack at a transportation hub, that locally things were going into play?
Well, absolutely. I mean, when something like that happens, like for the city of Chicopee, we do have Westover Air Force Base, and we do have a small metropolitan airport that private flights come in and out of, some commercial flights. So when anything like this happens, there is a heightened sense immediately. And it's not something we have to put out to people and say, hey, look, keep an eye on it. Our guys know it. When they hear something like this, it's just you're that much more aware of things. There's a little bit more patrols along fence lines. There's a little bit more patrols in the area of the base, things like that. The base obviously heightens its awareness. You're a little bit more focused when something like that happens, because with a lot of these incidents, there is a secondary attack. There's a primary attack, and then there is a secondary attack. So you never know. So you do just kind of focus a little bit more.
Yeah, I think you have increased communication and coordination with the larger entities. I think that you'll see an increase, just because, as Officer Wilkes said, you want to make sure that there isn't a second incident, or the best that you can do. So the better you open communication a little bit more, instead of maybe once a week, once a day,
Right.
or something along those lines. So,
Yeah, I don't think it's as much tied to a transportation hub. The incident can take place anywhere. But I think, as has been mentioned, we see more and more where these attacks are more spread out. And I don't think there's a public safety official anywhere that doesn't, give a little extra scrutiny anytime something happens internationally to make sure that I think we all recognize those areas of concern in our own communities, and I think we give them proper attention, but I think we might give them an extra look, especially dependent on the information, and it goes back to that sharing of information. It's constant, but I think that it takes on a different tone and a different approach when incidents like that are going on.
And it seems like Brussels, seems so far away. It's across the ocean. Paris, so far away, but not anymore, right? You guys see it as something that could happen anywhere. Is that how you feel?
Well, exactly. I mean, the fire department, we don't go out and patrol any streets or anything like that, but we increase our training. We'll say we have the Conrail yard. So, I mean, that's a big hub for the Northeast. And all the kinds of chemicals and everything that's transported along that rail, so we kind of, gear up just in case that were to happen. What will we do? So
yeah, you're right. It's not just the things we think of that we've seen happen. Chemical warfare is also a very big possibility nowadays, and fire deals with that. Right?
Oh, exactly. Like I mentioned, a rail. We have Route 90, 91, Route 5. Coming right through our community. So there's a lot of truck traffic, a lot of vehicular traffic, and the rail itself. So, I mean, so we are constantly training, even with the CSX people. So,
I think in addition to it can happen anywhere, it's important to recognize that there are response plans, not only across the state, but all over, that incorporate agencies that are not involved in a larger incident to bring in resources. So your agency may be impacted depending on what the incident is, or long duration could sap all the available resources from your agency. So a neighboring police department, a neighboring fire department is going to supply people up to and including task forces that respond from all over the state for large incidents of any particular nature. So I think those response plans really strengthen our abilities locally, but also our abilities as a Commonwealth and as a nation to respond to large-scale incidents.
Last question that we have time for. Do you guys see some kind of attack as something that is likely to happen here? We don't want to talk about that, but you're prepared for it. Do you see it as something that is likely here nowadays with just all of the things at play, people traveling all of the time and social media attracting these terrorists to come here, there, and do these terrible things? Does it seem likely to happen in our local area?
I don't know if I'd use the term likely. There's a possibility, and that's what I would say. It could be during any event. I mean, we've seen the theater shooting. Most of the communities around have movie theaters. We have the large fairs, the Big E. I mean, it could, and that's when you want to gear up. Because if you said, it's not likely, we don't have to worry about it. We don't have to worry about it. And next thing it happens. And you go back to the tornado. When that tornado hit, where we expect, tornadoes don't happen in the Northeast. And it wipes out a path, through 10 communities. And, were we prepared for it? Well, I'd say we did a good job of doing it there as far as doing the unified command and everything. And you knew, a lot of it is, it's, who you know to call. Having those phone numbers.
It seems like everyone feels the same way, I would say.
Absolutely.
Right? All right. That's actually all the time we have. I wish we could talk for more time. But thank you so much all for being here. An interesting conversation. We'll be right back after the break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Thanks for watching 22 News in Focus. Remember, you can watch it all in its entirety again on our website, wwlp.com. Have a great Sunday.